Good afternoon. We're sitting here having a great conversation with Kristen Woodward. Kristen, such a fascinating conversation. Let's get started at a really important part here. You are an art teacher at Albright University. Can you just talk about what you do there? And you
Sure.
mentioned your studio and your students, and
Yes.
there's so much to go on right there.
There is. This will be my 22nd year at Albright College. I teach painting and printmaking primarily. And as an undergraduate liberal arts college, I have a number of students who are there as art majors, and then I have students who are just taking the course as an elective, and they might come from the chemistry or math department, so they add a lot to the mix. I do have a studio space that's adjacent to the facility where the students work. So it's nice, there's like a flow between me practicing what I teach, and students often come in and look at my work, and I'm on sabbatical this semester, so I'm really missing their feedback.
COVID-19 during this time, its effect on your art, its effect on your teaching, and you mentioned earlier some really creative things that you're doing with students when they run out of product to generate art with. Can you talk about all those things?
Yes. I had never taught online before. I had no interest in teaching online. I'm very much a physical, hands-on kind of instructor. And so at the spring break period, our provost said, we're going to have a 2-week gap and then students may come back. So I told my students, take your materials home. I don't know when you're coming back. We may be online for the foreseeable future. It's a real time of uncertainty and kind of a crash course in learning the programs like Moodle and Zoom and, figuring out how to interact with these people online. And a lot of the students just took to it naturally. They really like to engage that way. They gave each other good feedback. Some of them really struggled with space to work. I mean, they were working on a kitchen table or, in a corner of a shared living space. And when they started running out of paint, I wasn't sure what to do with them. I thought, okay.
Paint that they were going to paint.
The actual paint, right. So I thought, okay, if you can't get the paint, because the mail ordering was also slow, I said, go around your house and find colored paper from any source possible.
And they did find colored paper in their house.
They did. They found cereal boxes and they were cutting out the color around the words and making palettes of colored paper. And some of their works were really exquisite. I mean, really unusual. I don't know. I think it was a time of incredible frustration, and a lot of people had a certain amount of anxiety too that was always under the surface. So I know I was painting like crazy. I think this is
painting like crazy because you're dealing with the COVID, and it's a way to release.
Absolutely. I mean, I was so grateful to still have a job, to still be teaching, but there was this underlying angst, and so I felt restless when I got off the computer, and I physically wanted to move as well. So I spent a lot of time in my studio. I mean, I don't remember times where I'd stay up late at night painting since grad school. And I think since May, I've made something like 45 paintings. It's just, it's kind of crazy that I have all this energy.
I got to break in.
Yeah.
So 45 paintings in a very brief period of time.
Yeah.
Tell us how it happens. Do you plan it out? Do you stand there and the thing just comes out of you? Is there an inspiration, or do you discover the inspiration as you're doing it? How does it work?
I'm going to say yes to all of that.
Yes to all of
I
that.
for a long time have been dealing with images of animals as stand-in for figural predator-prey relationships. So what does that mean? So I've been using animals symbolically. And so when COVID hit, I started finding ways of putting like a pangolin or bats into my paintings, representing how humans have manipulated nature and our interaction with the environment. But another project I had over the summer was actually working with a student on a project that was specifically funded at Albright. It's called the Albright Creative Research Experience. We call that the ACRE program.
Is that a regular program?
It is.
So students can apply for
Students apply. You apply in teams, and you collaborate with a student over the summer and research something more in depth that you wouldn't have time to over the general fall or spring semester. And both Faith Mirovich and I had gone to Costa Rica, and we had had some experience with the Baruca indigenous people there. and they had shamanic kind of interest in animals as symbols of transformation. They also have a festival every year called the Dance of the Devils, and it involved the tribesmen, just the men, creating these elaborate human-animal hybrid masks, and they reenact the resistance to the Spanish conquerors. And it's really a beautiful ceremony. So Faith and I started researching this because I'm going to be teaching a course in the spring and possibly taking students to Costa Rica if we can travel internationally again. And so I started painting these devils, and we've got a couple of them here. And
they're kind of frightening.
They are, because I think what my challenge was is I liked this idea of wearing this mask of the devil to kind of, I don't know, protect yourself from your enemy in some ways.
So the devil mask that may be in your painting is driving evil away?
Exactly, exactly. And it kind of aligned perfectly with COVID. So my challenge was, you know, this unseen threat, you know, how to protect yourself with, ironically, a mask, but a face mask rather than just the little mask. But I also didn't want to get into cultural appropriation and be using the Baruka's imagery. So I was trying to draw upon my own background with kind of a Judeo-Christian tradition to do the devils.
I want to say this. You speak very cerebrally at times about your influences.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, is that typical of artists that you hang out with? Or are you kind of a rare character? You bring world travel, philosophical approaches, cultural approaches to the conversation. Can you weave those together for us a little bit?
I mean, obviously I like to talk, right? And I think I'm more of an extrovert. And so it's natural for me to kind of articulate things that I'm ruminating about in my art. I think for some artists, that process is more intuitive. They don't necessarily like to talk about it. They feel like the work should stand alone, or they may be involved in purely formal concerns. And I used to be, years ago. I would work, you know, completely abstractly, non-objectively. And the older I got, I think I felt like there was too much to say, and it wasn't satisfying to just work with formal interests. So yeah, so all those things in my life start tumbling into my paintings.
Say more about there's too much to say than simply being limited by formality.
Yeah. I mean, I think art about art can be very pleasurable to engage in, to view, but for me, my art had to be about life. It couldn't just be about art. So I've been a long time volunteer at the Humane Society of Berks County. I'm on the board of Humane PA. And those concerns about animal welfare and the environment, I couldn't separate them from my art making at some point in my life. All of those things started, those threads kept coming together. And sometimes I feel like my work gets a little crazy and busy, and I keep trying to kind of quiet it down, but then everything kind of rushes back in again.
Okay. I'm seeing that you really work with color spectacularly. You are definitely a colorist.
Oh, thank you.
Speak about color to us and how it works in your paintings. And I see that there's a lot of blue here as kind of a foundational color. And what's that about?
Now that's a good question. I tend to work in encaustic. So if you don't know what encaustic is, it's using oil paint or pigment into a wax medium. So I use beeswax and damar resin, and I have these little cups all over hot plates in my studio. And it just smells amazing. So
amazingly good.
Amazingly good. Yeah, it's really intoxicating. If you like the smell of beeswax and oil paint.
It's like being in a Catholic church, the smell of beeswax.
It is.
Yes.
But I think
refreshing.
I kind of enter into that zone. You know, like when you work in encaustic, you can't paint for 5 minutes. It's a whole production of...
Once it starts, you've got to carry it through.
Right, because you need the wax to be like a honey-like consistency. So there's some time involved. But then what's so great about it is, I love this, I tell my students, encaustic is never wet or dry. It's cold or hot. So you paint it when it's hot, or it can splatter, and then once it cools, it sets, so it's no longer wet. And you can carve into it. So the palette, I have to kind of mix before I start painting. And you really can't
Your colors
mix
are
them.
selected for you by the time you get... Okay.
Right, and they really don't mix that much on the support. Like I work on wooden supports rather than canvas because they'll crack if you build up too much wax on canvas. You need a rigid support. So there's this kind of really physical process of kind of scraping away, and I've got heat guns, and maybe like a little bit like cooking too. you know, but I think when I use blue, I'm thinking of it as like sky or water. Like the Devil series are all titled Between the Devil and the Sea. So kind of like the whole old adage of between the devil and the deep blue sea, like you really don't have a choice, you know?
Okay.
So maybe the blue, that's where that comes in.
So here you are, COVID enters in, Kristen was an artist before, and she's going to be an artist afterwards. So how did COVID change what you're doing, and do you expect to go back to what you were before when there might be more control over COVID?
Yeah.
Or is this going to be like something that moves you into a new direction in your world that's going to be a radical change?
Yeah, it has been. I mean, it's got me thinking about things in a very different way. I think those threads of environmental stewardship, animal welfare were always present in my work, but they evolved with COVID in terms of the selection of animals, the imagery of the devils. I'd like to think maybe it would become more positive, you know, as we emerge, but I'm still kind of troubled that how we interact with nature and the environment, this is not really necessarily a surprise. That it's more of a foreboding of like the new normal about how these diseases can manifest. But I don't know that I'll necessarily feel that in the future that my work needs to be so didactic. You know, right now I think it leans towards illustration because there are very specific images I want to deal with. Maybe I'll be able to go back to some of those formal ideas when things calm down.
You're a person who shows your art. Can you talk a little bit about some of your art shows, and are they memorable to you, and how do you prepare for one of those things?
Yeah,
Just some
yeah.
ideas about your audience and
Yeah.
showing your things.
Yeah, I really like that my work can go far afield and get to audiences and interact with people that I'll never encounter. I did have a gallery in New Orleans called Hal Burnett that closed after the pandemic, which was horrible because it was a beautiful gallery right on Julia Street. Right now I'm showing at a lot of college galleries. I'm in a show right now at Concordia University called Food Matters, and they're mostly paintings of heirloom apples. So again, you think, what do apples have to do with these paintings? But they're still about how we deal with selectivity and choice when it comes to nature and how we shape nature to meet our needs. So they're mostly paintings of these heirloom fruits. And then I'm at another show at Drury University that deals with folklore and mythology, and that's when the devils kind of play into that. And I think college galleries are really great. Like I showed at Alvernia, I've showed at local college galleries, because you have an audience that's not necessarily motivated by sales or, you know, what's going to match their living room. You know, they're interested in a dialogue. So they're often much more receptive to work that's experimental.
I have to ask this question. So you mentioned the living room and art that sells and all this kind of stuff. So what is an artist, and what's the role of the artist, especially in this world where those kinds of things enter into the picture? And I wonder if people really have a sense of the artist in a certain way when they're looking for things that match their furniture.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think there's different kinds of artists that have different functions. I think commercial art is wonderful. I mean, it makes our life much more colorful and visually interesting. But I think when it comes to art making for self-expression, it really is in a more precarious place in the marketplace. Every once in a while I'll sell a painting and it's like, wow, how exciting. But I'm not making the work to sell. I'm also very lucky that I have a day job, and that makes a huge difference, that I have the freedom to do that. But I think artists, for the most part, through history, have reflected the times that they've lived in. And so that's why, again, I'm kind of feeling as though it's incumbent upon me to distill my experiences into what I make. And how does here and now impact the artist? So our journeys are all taking us different places. I mean, the show that's here at Yocum now is so interesting because the work is so different. And some of it deals more overtly with COVID, or with healthcare workers. There's some really beautiful work in the gallery, but some just shows, I think, a certain kind of tension and energy, and that's also illustrating the moment of where we are now.
So the here and now, so moments
Yeah.
ago you spoke about formality, which
Yeah.
probably has a history, and here and now is kind of not exactly that. So you blend a variety of like starting points for your work.
Yeah, and I like seeing that artists have the flexibility to reach different audiences in different ways too. Like something might really resonate to you that doesn't to someone else, and I think that's okay. It is a dialogue. And as much as I love to talk about it, I mean, hopefully it functions as a visual object too. Like there was an artist I knew years ago in Georgia. Her name was Therese Zemlin, and she said, "My work is not about something; it is something."
What a great perspective that
Isn't
is.
it?
You
'Cause it's
suppose
a
people
thing.
understand what that means? It's not about something, but it is something.
Right, and so when I have students sometimes that are reluctant to work abstractly, they're like, "Well, I don't understand it. What is it?" I'm like, "Well, we listen to music that doesn't have words, and we don't get anxious about that. But there's something about visual art, I think, that people feel we should commandeer a narrative and understand everything that's being communicated. And sometimes it's a little more nuanced than that."
Can I ask a dangerous question?
Okay.
So we've got COVID going on.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of issues with regard to racism and
Yes.
violence. Does art have a role in the transformation of people so that we become accepting of one another and that we gain a perspective on humanity that is healthy and wholesome and integrated? What does art do there?
I wish I could say that was the answer and we could paint our way into more peaceful times. I think if we look throughout history, again, it's been more of holding up a mirror and having us self-reflect on the human condition. I mean, when I look at cave paintings like Chevreau caves or Lascaux, to me, it's like something hits me in the core of my being. Like, we are all human beings and we all come together and have this urge to leave our mark. And I think so often we get divided into our tribes. I mean, I'm hoping that art making, music making, dance, all of these creative outlets remind us of our humanity. And I think that's really all we can do.
You're a great advertisement for the Yocum Institute because so much of that goes on here. That's fabulous. Just a couple more questions.
Sure.
The devils, they're salvific devils because they're protecting other people. So
Right.
there's a kind of a coincidence of opposites happening there. On the one hand, you've got something that is ferocious and frightening,
Right.
but on the other hand, there is something sacred about what you're trying to do. How do you bring those things together? Or is it okay if they just stay apart? So you look at this and you wonder what was going on in her mind, and then you explain to us what was going on in your
Yeah.
mind. And it's an interesting perspective, juxtaposition.
Well, I mean, going back to what you were talking about with some of the racial tensions, some of the, vitriol that around politics today, I think what we are looking at is absolutes, that we sometimes think of things as a division between good and evil. And the devils sometimes represent that, but I think, again, there's a little bit more ambiguity there, and maybe it's the gray area we need to live in a little bit more.
Okay. Can I ask you to tell us maybe about people who were inspirational to you from the art world when you were studying? Were there classic artists or modern artists, or who are the greatest influences on what you do and how you do it?
Good question. Well, I could go on and on about this. I know we only have a few more minutes. I would say I love the raw energy of the abstract expressionists. The kind of force, this idea, again, that innate sense of art making. But my favorite artist of all time is Rufino Tamayo. He's a Mexican painter that was contemporary with Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, but rather than going with a traditional figural narrative, he uses more abstract animal shapes, and he was tapping into more indigenous imagery. And it just so happens Albright College had a collection of some of these prints, and they were in flat file drawers. I said, "How do you have these Tamayos that no one can see?" And so I convinced them to frame one, and they bolted it to my office window, or on my office door against the window. So whenever I walk into my office, I see Tamayo, and that's such an inspiration to me. And I always think when my work kind of veers off in a direction, I kind of want to bring it back to Tamayo.
What's the hope for students who study art in the future about being able to be productive and do the kind of things that they really enjoy? Are you finding that students are coming desiring to be artists and they come with something they want to do? How does that work?
They are. I think the challenge is how can they satisfy that desire to be an artist with interacting in the marketplace, in their communities, and I think that's what we try to set up for them between arts administration, education programs, graphic design. Find a way to get your work out there because it's certainly cathartic to make it, but that's really only the beginning. I think it has to be a dialogue and they have to be able to share it with the world.
You are definitely a living artist, and it seems like you are producing stuff constantly, and it just naturally flows from who you are and what you do. It's a delight to have had this conversation. So,
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Kristen, thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.